Let's have a look at shading and texturing of fragments in fracture effects. In this tutorial, I'm going to cover 4 segments: shader propagation, or the transferring of a shader of an unbroken mesh to the fragments of that unbroken mesh. Second section is how you can change shaders after you have broken your object. You have to go through a little workflow that I will explain. And then the texturing and displacement of the interior faces of the fragments themselves, so you can get nice realistic looking fragments. Let's start by having a look at shader propagation. So I have a statue here which has an orange shader assigned to it. Orange shader here in the hypershade. I have a very basic simulation with nice and big fragments, so we can clearly see the outside and the inside of the fragments. But as you can see, even though the unbroken mesh has a shader assigned to it, of course when the mesh gets broken up into different meshes, namely the ones, let me move this over a little bit, namely the ones in the fragment group, your fragments, then no shader is assigned to these fragments. Now, there's a very easy fix for Flatten Fracture. So if you go to the fracture menu, you go to shading and texturing, you get this window. All you have to do is you have to clear your selection, then you have to use one of the presets, in this case attach all, and you hit apply. Now, why do you have to clear your selection? It's explained here. So this tool affects all meshes under the current selection, or if nothing is selected, it defaults to everything. Why is that? Because sometimes you might have 10,000 fragments and you want to test the tool out first. So then you can just highlight some fragments and just test out if the shader is being transferred correctly. But I'm just going to go clear selection. I have attached all. I'm going to hit apply. And then you will see here that it will have processed those 67 meshes, which are the fragments. And if I move forward now, you will see that the fragments have gotten the shader from the unbroken mesh. But of course, what you can see and what you can see here also in the perspective view is that that only happens on the outside of the fragments, because that is the data that is known for the with the unbroken mesh. But Fracture has a solution for that as well. If you go into Fracture, you go to your object and you go to the interior shader section in the shading menu, or in the shading part of the menu here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, or I'm going to use another shader. I'm going to simply just drag that in there, and then I'm going to run this tool again. So again, I'm going to clear the selection, I'm going to hit apply, and you will see that the shader gets assigned here, and you can see here as well that the shader has been assigned to the inside of the faces, inside of the fragments. So let's go back a little bit, and if we wait for a little bit for the render or the preview to finish, you will clearly see that the outside is nice and orange, and the inside is this more white color from the standard shader. Let's go forward a little bit more, and there we go. We can clearly see this. So that's the first part, the shader propagation. Let's have a look now how you can change the shaders after you have set up your fracture. So this happens a lot, of course, but let's say that you set up your simulation first, and you didn't think about shading it, or a new shader came in, or you changed your mind, or whatever. So what we need to do is we need to change this orange shader, but with let's say a chrome shader, which we have there. So because of the way that Maya works, we have to go do a little bit of a workaround, or it's a little bit of a we have to dig around a little bit in the node editor. It's not too bad, and I will show you now how to do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go back to the first frame. I'm going to render my render camera, my shot cam. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is, let's say that we take the Chrome shader, which is, where is it? This one here. Let's make it a bit bigger. No, not so big. So let's take, that's annoying. Let's take the Chrome shader. So the first thing, we're going to go to the first frame. I'm going to take my unbroken mesh and I'm going to assign it like that. You can see that it gets the Chrome shading right now. But now obviously we have to assign it to the unbroken mesh, to the broken mesh, to the fragments. So let's bring up the node editor, select the break node, graph the break node, organize the graph editor, and by the way, if you go to the shading tool and you hit the help button, a web page will appear, and what I am explaining right now is explained in depth here. Changing shaders after breaking. So I highly advise you to read this, but I will show you now. But there's much more detail in the document. So this is the graph of the break node. So again, I hit graph up and down, or in input and output, and then I organize it a little bit here. So the key is to take this shape node, which is before the break geo, go to the attribute editor, and in the object display tab, untick intermediate object. Then, with this still selected, go to the shader that you want to assign and assign it. After that, tick this on again. Then, making sure that you're still on the first frame, go to the shading tool, make sure that you hit clear selection, and then hit, with attach all options on, hit apply. So now, if you go forward, you will see that the fragments indeed have the correct shader, but they do not have the interior of the fragments, do not have the correct shader yet. So the workflow there is the same. We don't need this anymore, but we can go to the fracture UI. Here you can see that it still has the original white shader. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Chrome as well, middle mouse button, drag it in here, and then run the tool again. Clear selection, apply. Now you will see that also the inside of the fragments has the correct shader assigned. It's still previewing, but you can clearly see that now everything has this Chrome shader. That's that. The third section is interior face texturing, although we kind of covered that already. But I will show you again, just to drill it home, and at the same time I will cover interior face displacement, which as you will see adds a little bit of displacement to the inside faces to add some realism to your fragments. So as I said, we've already done the interior face shading, but let's say that we have our Chrome statue here, but we want the inside of the fragments to be gold, let's say. So let's go to fracture, and here the interior shader is currently Chrome, and I know that I'm repeating myself, but just to make sure that everybody understands. So I'm going to drag in the gold shader, and then I'm going to go to the fracture menu, shading texturing, clear the selection, and just go to apply. And then if we bring up the render view, put that here and go forward a few frames, you will see that the inside now is gold. So as you will see here, the gold here is quite it's very smooth. So what the interior face displacing does is it can break that up by adding some displacement, but just on the inside of the fragments. So how do you do that? So let me just go to the other viewport and go here so we can more clearly see that. So if you go to the brick geo node and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see interior face displacement. So what you have to do is you have to use a 3D texture, but only a 3D texture, not a 2D texture, only a 3D texture, and that will displace only the inside of your fragments. So how does that work? So let's go to fragments only, and let's move the window a little bit. Let's add a, so like I said, 3D texture only 3D texture, and let's use a rock texture, and let's just use the defaults. And you do have to hit the update fragments button. So you will see that takes a little bit of time because it's tessellating the geometry and so on, and by default it generally messes it up a little bit, so you have to play around a little bit with these values. So the detail, the higher, this is a bit strange, but the higher you set the detail, the less detail you're actually going to get. So if you hold your mouse, if you hold your cursor over the attribute, you will get some explanation. Now I'm going to set some other values, and you have to play around with these a little bit, and obviously they differ based on the texture that you're using. But if I update the texture now, you will see that it's starting to look a little bit better. Now something that is a little bit of a bug in Maya 2018 is that it's losing the inside shader. You can see that the geometry is there, but it's losing some of the shading. Now don't worry, you can use the tool again. So just clear the selection, hit apply, and you will see that it comes back. And now that you can see some inside displacement, and your fragments will look much more realistic because they will look less clean. So let's just render that perspective camera, this one right here, and we might have to wait or refresh this a bit more. So there we go, and you will see that you have some displacement in there now, and you can see it in the interactive view as well, because just zoom in onto this fragment. If I turn this off and then hit update, you will see that it's much smoother, and you know that obviously doesn't look very realistic, and it looks very Voronoi, if you know what I mean. So if we add that there, it looks much better. It tessellates it, and if you see, let's set this to 4 and add this to 0.2, and then let that calculate. And of course you can change the values in the interior face displacement, but you can also change the values within your texture itself. You see that it lost some of the texture again, so again we'll have to go over that, clear that, apply, there we go. So what I was also going to say is that you can obviously also change the attribute of the texture. So let's say that we increase the grain size a little bit on this rock texture, and then update that again. You will see that update here in just a bit. There we go. So you can change all these attributes as well to get the look that you want, but you will see that this, you can see it here right now already, but you will see that that makes your fragments look much more realistic. So let's wait for a little bit, but you get the drift. So that's what I had to say about the shading and texturing within Fracture. There's obviously a lot more to do. Most of it is tweaking, of course, and getting the look that you want. But again, I strongly advise you to, if you go to the texturing and shading menu, to hit that help button and to read the documentation on this tool.